What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, I'd like to actually go over the nodes that we're going to be seeing in the DOM together. This is actually quite a tricky one. This might be a slightly shorter video, but it's super important, and I wanted to make it an independent video just so that we can actually see the different types of nodes that we're going to be working with throughout the course and all the time as we're going to be working with HTML, CSS, and the DOM in general through JavaScript. So without further ado, let's just take a look at what this whole node thing is all about. Okay, so to start, I kind of want to pose a question. Okay, so let's take a look at this HTML together right here. So let's say we have like our .type HTML, we have our HTML over here, and then in their HTML we have our head and a title. And then in our body here, we have our kind of a couple of things. These might look a little strange. Our body has an ID. So an attribute, which we'll get into in future videos. But we have this thing here. And for those of you that know HTML, you probably know what this is. We don't do it that often, but it's a comment. And so that's actually going to be ignored by the kind of the rendering per se. Over here, we have an H1 tag. So it's going to show up as kind of like a heading, a little bit bold, unless we change the styling for it. And it's going to say meow. And then down here, we have a woof. And this looks kind of weird. It's just floating on its own. And all this is like inside a body tag, which is all inside an HTML tag. So like, how is all this working, and how do we kind of explain one of these things relative to the other things? Okay, so HTML and CSS are both standards, and they have standardized ways to describe all of these different objects that we have inside of the HTML semantics. When we are working with the DOM, since really what that is an interface to the HTML and the CSS on the page, we also need a way to kind of describe the differences between these different types of objects that we're going to run into when we're looking at things like HTML. So really what we end up coming up with kind of as a consortium when they were coming up with this DOM interface is a different type of node for each of these objects. So let's take a look at what those are. So whenever I say node, I'd like you to think of exactly this. I'm actually not going to be referring to node in the context of Node.js anymore when we're talking about the DOM. When I'm talking about node, I mean these nodes right here. So there's actually many different types of nodes in the DOM. Let's go through the most common ones, and I'll kind of point out some important things that we need to keep in mind. So the first and most obvious one is an element node. And an element node is kind of what you would expect. When you're thinking of HTML, probably an element node is what comes to mind. So this would be like a p tag or a div tag, right? So all of these things here technically are elements. We have HTML, the head, the title, the body, and H1. Those are all elements, right? So the question is, well, is this thing an element? We'll see. Is this thing an element? We'll also see in a second, right? But very obviously, the other things that are tagged in HTML in the standard definitely make sense to be actual elements. Okay, so that's an element node. We're going to be mainly working with element nodes, but it's important to know these other things because they are actually part of the DOM, and we can run into them as we're working with the DOM and actually even create them later on, as we'll see. The second one is an attribute node. Now, this is a little bit trickier to get your hands on when we're actually working with the DOM, but we can actually do really cool stuff with this, and I'll show you a small example in this video as well. But this kind of sounds like what you might expect, right? So an attribute, for those of you that have seen HTML before, are kind of those things inside of the tag that are things like ID and class and data and all these different things that we can add inside of attributes. We can have our own custom ones, which we'll also look at in future videos. So in this particular case, an attribute example would be ID of farm. That would be an attribute for the body tag, and we can actually pull it out as its own node and actually insert different attributes into different nodes if we want as well. So it's a bit odd. This one's a bit strange. I know when I first saw it, I was just like, oh, you know, why is this a node? But we'll kind of see why later. But for now, just be aware that, you know, this can be a node, and we can think of it as a node in some cases. The next one is kind of interesting. So the next one's a text node. And I should probably mention that these numbers, you're probably thinking like, oh my gosh, Nader, like I know you don't edit your videos too much. You like to leave in the errors and stuff, but like, how did you mess up the counting so badly, right? How did you go from 3 to 8? So what these numbers are the IDs of the nodes. We're actually going to be seeing this quite a lot as we actually work with these nodes, and I'll mention why we're kind of skipping so many numbers here in a moment. But when we think about the text node, this is actually what we see over here. So for example, this woof right here is an example of a text node. Why? Well, it's not wrapped in an element tag. It's just kind of floating over there, but it's inside of the body element, for example, right here, but it's not really like a body per se. It's just kind of floating there, right? So that is an example of a text node, and attributes can be thought of as text nodes in certain contexts as well. But mainly we're going to think of text nodes like this, which is just text floating around where it shouldn't probably be, not that it shouldn't be floating around, but like, for example, you probably would have text in a paragraph tag, or you'd have text in an H1 tag. But if you have just text floating around outside those tags, and it's not really in like a meaningful manner, it's going to be just set as a text node, still inside the DOM, which is pretty cool. The next one is a comment node. So this one's pretty fun. You're probably thinking like, oh, wow, this is kind of cool that we actually have a node for this. It is definitely pretty cool. We can actually insert our own, remove them, and add them, all that kind of stuff. Super awesome. So it's actually its own type, its own totally separate node type, very different from an element. So in this case, for example, we would have this moo, right, would be an actual node in the actual DOM tree, and it would be a comment node, right? So that's kind of how that one works. These next ones we're going to see a bit less. But it's important to kind of mention here because we will see them once in a while. The document node is kind of the one, there's only really one of these usually, and it's usually the document, which is the root of the tree. So in this case, kind of this entire thing would be the document node, and we would just have that one. It would have its own special kind of type just to distinguish where the root of the tree is. And then we have the document type node, which is the actual doc type declaration at the top of the HTML file. So in this case, this thing right here, technically it's not really an element. So it has its own kind of node type, and that's the doc type node type in this case for the doc type. That was a lot of type and node and doc types in one sentence, but hopefully that makes kind of sense. So, useful, but we're not going to really be using them too much for now, at least. And one interesting one though, that we're not going to use right away, but it's actually going to become really common. And if you use React, this might sound a bit familiar, is the DocumentFragment node. Now, we're going to be using this for kind of cleaning up our DOM, because what a lot of people will do is they'll create what's called a div, which is kind of a divider, and we'll put elements inside of there, and we'll kind of wrap that for our objects. But what you can actually do instead, if you need to, is you can actually have a fragment, which itself is kind of a container to hold other elements, but it's not actually like a div tag, for example, right? So it disappears actually when it gets put into the DOM. So we'll look into more detail into this later on, but I do want to mention that it is actually there, and it is actually a node type that we will be using, and it can do a lot of very powerful things. So to kind of wrap this part up, I just want to mention element is what we're going to see the most of, and this is the one that we're probably most used to seeing and thinking about and working with. All of the different element tags that we'll be seeing. Attributes, we'll be seeing it once in a while. Text nodes, again, kind of once in a while, maybe not that often, because usually we want to put things in a tag. And comments, we'll probably see these once in a while as well, scattered out throughout the document. We usually comment like maybe a card section or something like that, something that might be a bit confusing or just help us kind of dictate in the code where we're actually looking at. Definitely more common in JavaScript, but you'll see a lot in the very large HTML files as well. So important to notice that these are actual nodes, and I'll show you what we mean when we talk about nodes in a second. Okay, so if we kind of put this in a visual diagram, this is what we're going to end up getting, right? So everything I just said, this is kind of the visual representation of that, minus some of the ones that we're going to be using a little bit less. So out here, we have the document node, right, which is the entire document. Then we have the doc type right up here, which is the document type node. And then inside of that, we have a whole bunch of different elements. Okay, so for example, these are all different elements in here, but I like poking fun at my meow H1 elements right here. So this is an H1 element node right here, right? This would be a body element. This would be a head element and a title element, etc. We can have attribute nodes if we pull them out in a specific way. So this ID equals farm would be like an attribute node if we grabbed it as a node. And as I mentioned, this moo right here is a comment node, right? Because that's a comment in HTML. And then this wolf right here, since it's just floating, not in a particular tag, and in something that doesn't really, is not meaningful as a text, in this case, the body, it's just being shown as a text node, which is actually a totally different type of node. And it's not, for example, a p tag or a h1 tag or something, right? So this is just floating inside the body, and it's its own type of DOM node, and it's stored separately. Okay, so let's just kind of get to coding, because I've always kind of noticed that, this is great visually to kind of think about these things, but really until you get your hands kind of wet with these, it's tricky to really like figure out what's happening. So let's pull up VS Code, and I'd like to create a file over here, and I'll call this node types.html. I was laughing last time because I think my previous file I called it html.html. I got some flack for that, so I'll try to name these better this time. I think my brain was doing too many things at once. So in here, let's add our doc type at the top. I always forget how to do this. There we go, doc type HTML. I'll zoom in a little bit more so you can see that. And just again, I have Prettier going here, as well as an extension that when I save it, it formats automatically using Prettier. And I showed you how to set that up in the first video. So if you see stuff jumping around the screen and all that kind of stuff looking all nice, it's not my beautiful typing, it's Prettier actually prettying it up for me so that it's easier for all of you to read. So inside of here, let's put an HTML tag, and that's going to get closed. And in here, let's put a head tag, and let's put a title tag. And in the title, I'm just going to say like hello world or something. Okay, and right below the head, I'm going to put a body tag. And inside the body, I'm going to put a comment. So that in HTML looks like that. So this is exclamation and then dash dash and then dash dash and then the closing angle bracket there. And I'll say, hello, this is a nice comment. Okay, there we go. And over here, I'm going to put an H1 tag. And I think I had my nice meow in there. You know what? Everybody loves emojis, so let's put our little cat in here as well. And out here, I'm going to put my text without any paragraph tag or without any kind of heading or anything like that. No span, no nothing like that. Just pure text, right? So this is some text in the body, just like that. Okay, I'm going to save the file, and everything kind of shifts over nicely for me. So let's kind of open this up in our browser in Chrome in the DevTools and actually poke around in here and see what these nodes are all about. Okay, so when you're looking at this HTML, I'd like you to just kind of really just look at it and be like, okay, like what are the different types of nodes based on what we just thought about, and what is the structure of this HTML actually going to look like, and what's going to show on the page. Okay, because we're going to actually inspect these, and we're going to take a look at what type of node each of these actually are. So if I right click on this, I can do reveal in Finder, I believe, or just kind of open it up in my Finder. Here it is, node types.html, and double click it. It's going to open up in my Chrome. There we go, it's my meow. I'm going to super zoom in here. I'm going to open up my inspector, my terminal over here. There it is, super large. And there we have it. So let's take a look at kind of how this works. I want to show you some really cool stuff with the DevTools. Eventually, we're going to actually be able to automate this a little bit using the actual DOM APIs, things like query selector and get element by ID and all that kind of fun stuff. But to start, I want to show you a really handy, useful tool that works really well in Chrome and Firefox. I think it works in the other browsers. Frankly, it works the best in Chrome. A lot of these things work the best in the Chrome DevTools, and I'll show you a few of these things that are a bit quirky and finicky in the other browsers. So if you do have access to Chrome, I encourage you to use it. If not, I hope this works in your browser, or you can use a slightly different method that you might know. All right, so to start, I want to actually point your attention to this icon right here. So this one is select an element in the page to inspect it, right? If I click on that, there's also a hotkey, which you can use. If I click on that, I can actually move my mouse around the screen, and I can select different parts of the page. And that is actually going to highlight the section inside of the Elements tab that I'm actually pointing at. So for example, you can see I'm hovering over meow. You can see very small text is actually giving me things like the color and the tag name and the font and the margin and some accessibility information, as well as actually highlighting it here on the right-hand side. I'm like pointing at my screen. I'm realizing you can't see that. But on the right-hand side of my screen here, you can see that it's actually highlighting the different things that I'm moving my mouse over. In this case, it's mainly highlighting the meow you can see on the right side of the screen. So if I do this and I click, I have selected this inside of the DOM. I can also just click and select these other things in the DOM just like this. I can open up the head and select the title, for example, right? But I'm going to select meow, okay, just to start. And you can see that I have this equals $0 being inserted. Now, I didn't put that in there. This was just kind of inserted by Chrome DevTools in this case. And you can see a little blurb that pops up, probably super tiny on your screen. But what it's saying is you can use this in the console to refer to this element. Okay, so we're going to use this both for this video and a couple of more going forward because it's a really useful tool. I actually use this every day. But we'll actually use some other tools to help automate this process as well. So $0 and other things, we'll see $1, $2 in a second. So just remember that at the back of your mind. Make sure to select one of these. So in this case, I'm going to select meow, and I'm going to switch to my console tab. So I'm super zoomed in, so I have to kind of click this to go to more tabs, but you should be able to see a few tabs up here. One of them should be the console, which is this one. I'm going to switch to that. And then you have your console open. Okay. Now, normally what you need to do to select elements from a page is something like query selector or element by ID or class name, things like that. But I want to show you something super cool. Now that we've actually highlighted that element in the Elements tab, we can actually do $0. And you can see that when I do that, it actually has the H1 given to me. So if I press enter, I actually get back my H1 tag. And if I actually highlight over it, right, you can actually see that it's actually live, right? It's actually giving me the H1 tag directly, which is super, super awesome. Now, technically, this has a lot of properties in it. This is more than just the tag. So I want to show you something super cool. What we can do is I can actually do properties on this thing because it's actually an object. This is a DOM object. Technically, it is a tag, yes, but it is actually an elements tag, which we'll see in a second, that has a lot of different properties on it. Look at this. There's all sorts of fun properties on here, and we can kind of use all of them, and there's even more down there. Technically, what you can do if you want to see all of them, you can say console.dir, and then we can technically do $0, and this should do a directory listing for us instead of just logging out the element, and we can open that up and we can see all of the cool stuff in here, all the events and all of the children and siblings and all that kind of fun stuff, which we'll look at in future videos as well. Okay, directory just helps us actually list out the keys and values in an object in this case, instead of the default behavior in the dev tools at least, which is to actually just log out the tag itself. Now, I want to show you an interesting thing inside of here. So if I actually open up this H1, if I scroll down to the end section, you can see that there's a few cool stuff in here, right? We have node name is in H1. That makes sense, right? This is an H1 node name. Notice it's in all caps. We have node type. This is what I wanted to show you right here, right? This is a node type of 1. Well, if we go back to our kind of list of nodes, right? We can see an element node is a node type of 1. So we can actually say that this is an element node. So I want to show you something else kind of interesting. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to do $0, and I'm going to access that node type, right, which is 1. And I'm going to say is equal to, and I can do document dot, or actually I could probably do this. I'll probably better do this, node dot element node, just like that. Okay, so we're grabbing a static property directly off of the node object or the node class, and it's called element node. This is going to be a number, and so we don't really have to think about the numbers because all the node types are numbers, as we saw. This is a number of 1. It's really hard sometimes to remember what that means, right? So we can use kind of plain English to check to see what kind of node it is. So here we're basically asking, is the node that we have selected, is its node type, which is 1, equal to 1 in this case, which is node.element node, right? So if I do this and I show you what node.element node, right? You can see that that's 1, right? So this is 1, so therefore it's true, right? Just so it's a nice kind of human readable format. It's a nice constant there that's available statically on the node object, as well as a document object and many other objects. So in this case, we can actually say that this node that I have selected is a element node. Now let's try this again. I'm going to take my mouse here and I'm going to select this one right here. Actually, it didn't work because you can't really select things that are technically not tags in this case. So I'm actually going to click this some text in the body to make that equal to $0 now. Okay, so I'm clicking this text node below the H1. I'm going to go back to the console and I'm going to say $0 dot node type. And now you can see that the node type of this is 3. It's no longer 1, right? And you're probably like, oh my gosh, Nader, why are you getting so excited about different numbers? Well, these are different node types, right? This is no longer a regular element, which is actually an HTML element, which we're going to see later on. This is actually an entirely different type of node with different types of properties and different properties on it. And it is a comment node. Okay, so to show you that, I'm going to say, is this equal to node.elements node? No, it's not. That's false, right? But is it equal to node.comment? Oh, I just realized that I should probably clear my console here. Node.elementNode, it's false. Is it equal to node.commentNode? And sorry, not comment node. This is a text node. Did I say comment? I'm wrong. Text node. There we go. Right? So it is a text node in this case. Okay, which is 3. So this is going to be 3, and this is going to be 3 as well. So we can definitely say that this is not an element node. This is an element node, and we're going to look at a couple others in a second. Why is this important? Well, when we're traversing the DOM or dealing with the DOM, creating our own versions of the DOM, adding and removing from the DOM, it's very important to know what kind of nodes we're actually currently looking at, because all of these things are in the DOM. Right? If I go back to the Elements tab, these are all in here. They exist inside of the DOM. Look at this. The comment is actually part of the DOM. Let me show you. If I go back to my console and now I do $0.nodetype, now I'm going to get 8, right? Which is a comment node. Just to prove that to you, I can say, is this equal to a node.comment node? And that's true, right? So these are all in the DOM, and they're all different types of nodes. And we can actually add and remove and manipulate all these different types of nodes, but it's important to know what kind of node we're manipulating, because the properties and the features to change an element node, for example, say an input box or an H1 in this case, or a paragraph tag, are very different from a simple text node, which is also, again, very different from a comment node, right? So these all have different meanings in the DOM, and they are inside the DOM, and we need to actually have it parsed properly so that when we're actually working with it, we know what to do. So I'm going to show you another interesting one. I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to select this one, the doctype.html. Okay, this is kind of a strange one, right? This is like not really an element. Is it text? Like, what is it, right? And that's why it has its own node type. So if I come back here, clear my console, and I do $0.nodetype, I get 10, right? And that's because this is a node.doctype. Where is it? Doctype node. DocumentType node. That's the one. Okay. So it's of type 10. All right. So there's all these different node types, and there's a few that I didn't mention in here on purpose because they have to do with things like XML, and there's a few legacy ones as well that are not used anymore. So the ones that I showed you are actually the most common ones that we're going to be running into, specifically the element, the text, the comment are the most common in this list. And sometimes we'll actually see the attribute. Very rarely will we have to work with these, except for maybe document fragment when we're trying to kind of make our semantics of our code a little bit more sense instead of having divs everywhere. Okay, so hopefully that's interesting, right? And I encourage you to actually write out more HTML and actually practice this, right? Like write out some more HTML in your file, reload the page, come back in here and select different nodes. Try to see, is it what you expect it to be? Right? What if you put it inside a paragraph tag, some text? What if you put some text in another type of tag? Does it suddenly become a text node? Is it a comment node? How do I make one or the other? What are the properties of each one or the other? What are the differences, right? These are all very interesting things to actually inspect once you're actually familiar with the fact that these are actually totally different things inside of the document, but all share the fact that they're part of the DOM. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is kind of the prototype chain or the class hierarchy for all of these things. Now, we're going to be looking and revisiting this quite a lot as we go through this series together, but I want you to keep this at the back of your mind because as we studied object-oriented programming or in the prototype chain previously in the JavaScript in-depth videos, this is something that's really going to help us understand how the DOM works and really why things are structured the way that they are when it comes to the DOM nodes. So at the root of everything in the DOM is this thing called the event target. And we'll see this when we actually get to events and bubbling and all that kind of stuff later on when we look at the DOM. So everything kind of inherits from event target, specifically node inherits from event target. So every node has all of the properties and methods inside of the event target class or the event target object. The node is then further split up into many different types of nodes. So we have this thing called the character data, and in character data, it further kind of breaks down in subclasses into comment and text nodes, which is what we just kind of looked at, right? So if we were to look at the prototype hierarchy for something like a comment or text node, we would actually see character data, then node, then event target. And I'll show you that in a second. Now, we're going to be mainly focused in this kind of center vertical right here. So we have node, and then we have something called an element, which is an elements node. And then we have something called an HTML element specifically. So hypertext markup language type of element, because there's a few other types of elements as well. But most of the time when we're working with HTML, of course, we're going to be looking at HTML elements. Now, the interesting thing is that this provides a nice base for all HTML elements. So if you think of paragraphs, inputs, you name it, H1s, whatever, all those things are HTML elements, which are nodes, which are event targets. All right, which is super cool. So every single one of these paragraphs, for example, any DOM node is going to have its own class or its own object, and it's going to inherit from HTML element, which inherits from element, which inherits from node, which inherits from event target. Now, node can be further broken down into a couple other things. As I mentioned earlier, we have document, we have the document type, we have attributes, and then we have document fragments. All of these are different types of nodes, but mainly we're going to be working with kind of what we have in the center here. So what we can actually do is some pretty cool things. So let me show you what I mean by kind of this prototype chain, just to kind of prove it out to you, because it's actually really interesting to actually see visually. So if I have selected, for example, my H1 again, okay, I'm actually going to select my H1. I'm going to go back to my console, not sources. I'm going to go back to my console, and I'm going to clear this out. And I'm going to bring up my $0. Okay, so that's my H1 right there. Perfect. Now, I'm going to actually do a console.dir of my H1. Not my H1, of my $0. Getting confused here. There we go, of my $0. And what I want to show you is that if I scroll all the way here down to the bottom, what we're going to see is, oh, this is a bit cut off here, but we can see a prototype HTML heading element, right? So this is actually an HTML heading element. So let me scroll back up just so you can see that, right? The prototype of this H1 is the HTML heading element, which is one of the element types for HTML element. Now, if I scroll down all the way past this prototype, we're going to arrive eventually all the way down to the next prototype right here, which is, let me show you in a sec, if I scroll back up, which is HTML element. Okay, and if I scroll down past that prototype chain, you're kind of seeing where this is going, and I encourage you to do this yourself as well, because it's definitely a very interesting and useful thing to do, I promise. Once you get past HTML element, you will actually get to element as the prototype. Okay, and this is the actual prototype, hence why I actually coded it this way when we looked at the prototype chains in the JavaScript video. Sorry for the jumping around here. I keep clicking the arrows by accident. So, so far we've gone from a heading element to HTML element to regular element. So we expect to see node next. So let me just quickly scroll down there. You can see there's a whole bunch of getters and setters here. There we go. We have a node, which is right here. So the next prototype is node. You can see that inside node, we have these things like the attribute node and all the constants in there as well. If I scroll down past that, you can see that we have event target. It's a bit hard to see on my screen. There it is at the very, very bottom. I'll put it below my little face. So hopefully you can see right here, event target. And then below that is the object prototype, okay, which technically everything inherits from to some degree. So that's kind of the whole prototype chain, right? So we kind of traveled up this prototype chain. So what I really want to show you though after that was if I do $0 is an instance of, and if you recall from when we looked at prototypes and classes, instance of can let us check to see if one of the other object types is in the prototype chain of this particular subclass or this particular item that we're looking at. So in this case, I want to see, is it an instance of element? It is, right? Is it an instance of HTML element? It also is. Is it an instance of node? It is, because we just saw that it's in the prototype chain. Is it an instance of a comment node? Or in this case, comment, I guess, in general? No, it's not. Is it an instance of character data? No, it's not, right? Is it an instance of document? No, it's not, right? Because those are all different things. We need to travel straight up the prototype chain, and only if it's in that prototype chain is it actually going to show it to us. Is it an instance of event directly? No. How about event target? Yes, yes it is. Okay, so that is pretty awesome. And you'll notice that if you do this for pretty much everything, what we'll see is that, like, for example, let me actually show you this really quick. If I choose this guy, I always do that by accident, some text in the body, the text node right here, we know that the text node, its direct kind of prototype is character data. It's not element or HTML element. So if I switch back to my console with the text selected, let me clear out my console here, and I do $0, that's my text, right? And I do $0, is it an instance of HTML element? And we can see that that's false, right? But is it an instance of the character data element? And yes, it is. Okay, so the reason I'm showing you this, and this might seem slightly pedantic, is that it really is important to basically understand this hierarchy and the different node types, because as we're working with the DOM, we're going to run into these all the time. We can actually construct entire documents entirely from JavaScript without even a single line of HTML by using the DOM methods to actually build out everything in here, including things like attributes, text nodes, comments, indistinguishable from if it was written in regular HTML in the first place, which is actually the entire joy and awesomeness of learning all these DOM methods in the first place. So I hope that this video was valuable. I know it was a little bit of a shorter one. What we're going to do in the next video is go through a bunch of exercises to really hammer this idea home of nodes and the DOM and how they work together and this prototype chain. There's a whole bunch of really fun exercises in there. I can't wait to go through them with you. I'll be posting that shortly. And if you did appreciate and like this video and learn something, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to hear in the comments what your thoughts are. Have you seen these types of nodes before? Have you ever wondered what a node is or what an element is, or how you can have just text floating around or comments and why they appear in the DOM, right? It's all really, really awesome and interesting stuff. We're actually just skimming the surface and we're building up the fundamentals in order to really go deep into these. I really can't wait to actually go deeper as we're kind of building this up. But in the next video, let's take a look at some exercises together on the idea of node and node type. I'll see you in that one. See you later.